Peace between the nations? Hard to believe. This journey of negotiation isn't just about promises. It's a covert war where life and death constantly hang in the balance. Kael, a diplomat from Earth, steps into an ancient Beastfolk fortress, where war isn't only decided by treaties, but by strength, respect, and sometimes even direct strikes. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic tales. Your support helps us bring you more amazing story. The massive stone doors of the Beastfolk fortress groaned open, kicking up a cloud of dust that swirled like an unwelcoming hello. Kael adjusted the collar of his diplomatic uniform, his boots echoing against the cold mountain stone as he stepped inside. The fortress, carved centuries ago, looked like it hadn't seen a broom since humans figured out fire. He muttered under his breath, "Peace talks, huh? I'll probably end up as dinner before I sign anything." The Beastfolk guards flanked him, towering figures draped in fur-covered armor, their primal weapons glinting faintly in the dim light. Kael shrugged, flashing a grin. "Relax, fellas, I don't bite. Pretty sure that's your specialty." They didn't reply, just let out low growls, their clawed feet scraping the floor as they led him deeper. He'd walked into tense negotiations before, but this was different. Here, power wasn't measured in treaties or handshakes. It was in stares, stance, and the heft of a blade. He carried no weapon. That was the deal. Unarmed, a gesture of peace. Still, the air pressed against him like he'd strolled into a predator's den, wearing nothing but a smile and a prayer. The main chamber opened before him, a wide, circular space lit by narrow slits in the rock that let fading sunlight stream through like beams from a dying star. At the far end stood Sylra, the Beastfolk general. Her skin shimmered a faint jade under the light, and her red eyes burned like slow embers. Her armor, more ceremonial than practical, or so it seemed, clung to her broad shoulders, though Kael had no doubt every piece could kill if she wanted it to. She gripped a thick, blunt sword that looked more like a slab of iron than a weapon, her stance tall and unmoving as her gaze pinned him in place. He offered the formal earth greeting, a bow that was respectful but not groveling. Sylra didn't budge. She stepped down from her perch, each movement sending a faint tremor through the stone floor, her presence heavy as the mountain itself. When she reached the center of the chamber, she pointed the flat of her blade at him, her voice booming loud enough to rattle the walls. "You come to negotiate peace, but you haven't earned my respect." Kael swallowed, his throat dry. "So, what? I write you a thank you note." A flicker of something, amusement, maybe, crossed her face, gone as quick as it came. "Fight me," she said. "Our law demands it." Silence crashed over the room. The council above, perched on tiered stone benches, watched without a word. Marcus, Kael's aide, looked like he might faint in the shadows. Kael's instinct screamed. This was insane, but he wasn't helpless. He'd trained enough to hold his own, even if not against a warlord who could probably snap him like a twig. He stepped forward. "If it's tradition, I won't dishonor it. But fair warning, I'm not great at losing quietly." A murmur rippled through the chamber. A smaller Beastfolk approached, offering a ceremonial wooden sword, dull but solid, meant for skill, not slaughter. Kael took it, settling into a ready stance. Sylra didn't move at first, her eyes tracing him, reading every shift of his weight, every twitch of his grip. Then she lunged. She was fast, too fast for someone her size. Their blades clashed, the impact jarring Kael's arms as he barely deflected her swing. He tried to counter, but she sidestepped like a blur, knocking the sword from his hand with one effortless motion. It skittered across the floor, spinning to a stop near the edge of the circle. Kael stood there, chest heaving, heart pounding like a drum. Sylra remained calm, her breath steady as she pressed the flat of her blade against his chest. "Disarmed," she said simply. He looked up at her, frustration simmering but masked with a grin. "Yeah, disarm my pride too while you were at it." She didn't laugh, didn't gloat. She stepped back, lowering her weapon, her red eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You knew you'd lose, yet you stood here. That's courage." He caught his breath, expecting some verdict, pass or fail, whatever this test was. But instead, Sylra tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over him once more. Then, loud enough for the whole council to hear, she asked, "Is this human spoken for?" The room froze. Marcus nearly dropped his datapad. The council muttered, a mix of shock and disbelief. Kael blinked, sure he'd misheard. Come again?" Sylra repeated, slower, deliberate. "Are you single?" He let out a dry laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, sure am. Didn't know peace came with a dating clause, though." The chamber erupted. Gasps, scoffs, a few muffled chuckles. The Beastfolk council stared at Sylra like she'd lost her mind. Marcus looked ready to bolt, but Sylra ignored it all, her red eyes locked on Kael, unyielding, as if she'd just shifted the entire game and didn't care who noticed. After the fight, the echoes of clashing blades still lingered in Kael's ears as he followed a Beastfolk guard up a winding stairwell to the upper dining chamber. The invitation had come from Sylra herself, delivered with the same blunt authority she'd used to challenge him. He wiped the sweat from his brow, muttering to himself, "If this is the consolation prize for getting my ass kicked, I might lose more often." The guard didn't react, just pushed open a heavy wooden door and stepped aside. The room was smaller than the council chamber, but no less imposing, its stone columns etched with claw marks and faded murals of Beastfolk triumphs. Torchlight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Sylra sat at the far end of a long, rough-hewn table, her armor swapped for a dark robe threaded with gold. Her jade skin caught the light, shimmering faintly, and her red eyes tracked Kael as he entered. She looked less like a warlord now, more like a person, still commanding, but stripped of the battlefield's edge. She nodded toward the seat across from her. "Seat." Kael slid into the chair, flashing a grin. "So, do all your peace talks come with dinner? Or am I just special?" She didn't smile, but her gaze softened as she poured a thick, amber liquid into a stone cup and slid it toward him. The scent hit him first, earthy, sharp, like soil after a storm. He took a sip, wincing as it burned his throat. "Wow, that's aggressive. You sure this isn't a second challenge?" Sylra ignored the quip, cutting into a platter of roasted vegetables and seared meat between them. "You accepted the duel, even knowing you'd lose," she said, her voice low but steady. "Not many would." He speared a piece of meat with a fork, shrugging. "I figure it was just part of the ritual, right up until you asked if I was single." Her eyes flicked up, a faint curve tugging at her lips, not quite a smile, but close. "I got curious," she said, the words hanging in the air like smoke. They ate in silence for a while, the clink of stone against stone the only sound. The food was heavy, spiced roots that stung his tongue, vegetables he couldn't name, but good grounding. Kael watched her as she chewed, noting the way she didn't avoid his gaze or try to fill the quiet with charm. She just existed, solid and unbothered, a stark contrast to the diplomats he was used to, all polished words and hidden knives. He set his cup down, leaning forward slightly. "What is this, Sylra? A joke? A tactic? You're a general. I'm a diplomat. If this is politics, it's the weirdest play I've ever seen." She met his eyes, her red stare sharp but not hostile. "It's not politics," she said bluntly. "It's a question. I wanted to see the man behind the title." Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the space between them. Kael raised an eyebrow, half smirking. "And? What did you find?" She tilted her head, studying him as if he were a map she hadn't yet charted. "Someone brave enough to stand before me, honest enough not to pretend he could win." Her voice carried a weight, not flattery, but observation, like she'd peeled back a layer and liked what she saw. Kael laughed, a short, dry sound. "You're going to make me blush, General, but don't say that too loud. My aid'll think I traded peace for a fancy meal." Sylra didn't laugh, but the lines around her eyes softened, like a fire bank for the night. She leaned forward, just enough that the torchlight caught the gold threads in her robe. "Wars taught me to see enemies everywhere," she said, quieter now. "I wondered if there was more to you than that." Kael's grin faded, his fingers tightening around the cup. "And if there is?" She didn't answer right away, just held his gaze, the silence stretching like a thread pulled taut. Then she sat back, her voice steady but softer. "Then I'd like to know him." He blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. No grand declarations, no diplomatic dance, just a straight line from her to him. "Well," he said, recovering with a chuckle, "I didn't pack a manual for this kind of negotiation, but I'm not complaining." She didn't respond, but her eyes lingered, red and warm like embers in the dark, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if something unspoken had settled between them. The next day dawned gray and jagged, the mountain path stretching ahead like a scar across the Beastfolk lands. Kael trudged beside Sylra, his coat flapping in the biting wind as they surveyed an old trade route she hoped to reopen for peace. Loose gravel crunched under his boots, and he shot her a sidelong grin. "If this is your idea of a second date, I'm demanding better scenery next time. Maybe a beach?" Sylra didn't reply, her red eyes scanning the cliffs above, her jade skin catching the muted light like a polished stone. Her silence broke with a sharp hiss as an arrow sliced through the air, embedding itself in the rock inches from Kael's head with a dull thwack. He ducked, heart lurching. "Okay, never mind the beach. How about indoors?" Before he could finish, a dozen rogue beastfolk dropped from the ledges, their armor patched and scavenged, eyes wild with fury. Sylra snarled, drawing her sword in one fluid motion and yanking Kael behind a boulder. "Traitors," she growled, her voice rough as the stone around them. "They don't want peace." Kael peeked out, adrenaline spiking. "Yeah, and I don't want to be target practice." He grabbed a jagged rock, hurling it at a rogue lunging for Sylra's back. It cracked against the attacker's skull, sending him sprawling. Sylra spun, her tail whipping through the air to knock two more off their feet, her blade flashing in tight, controlled arcs. They moved together, not with words, but with instinct. Kael ducking and striking where he could, Sylra cutting through the chaos like a storm carved from muscle and steel. When the last rogue fled, vanishing into the rocks with a howl, the path fell silent save for their ragged breaths. Sylra slumped against the boulder, a gash on her shoulder oozing dark blood through her torn armor. Kael dropped his rock, hands shaking as he stumbled toward her. "You're hurt. Come on, we've got to get out of here." She waved him off, but her grimace betrayed her. He ignored it, looping her good arm over his shoulder and half dragging her toward a shallow cave nearby, its mouth barely visible through the dust. Inside, the air was damp and cool, the only light a faint glow seeping through a crack in the ceiling. Kael eased her down against the wall, tearing a strip from his shirt to press against her wound. "Hold still," he muttered, his voice tight. "You're a mess." Sylra's chest heaved, her red eyes locked on him. "You're too calm," she said, her tone hoarse but steady. He smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No time to freak out when you're bleeding all over me." The cave grew quiet, the wind outside a distant whine. Sylra shifted closer, her warmth brushing against him like heat off a dying fire. Blood stained the cloth, but her breathing steadied, and her gaze held his, sharp and searching. "You didn't run," she said, almost to herself. Kael's hand stilled, the makeshift bandage pressed firm. "Not much point. Pretty sure you'd catch me anyway." Her lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, but her eyes burned deeper, like embers flaring in the dark. She leaned in, slow and deliberate, her breath grazing his cheek, warm and ragged from the fight. Kael didn't pull back, couldn't, even if he'd wanted to. Their lips met, not rushed or desperate, but like two currents colliding in a narrow stream, steady and inevitable. Her heat seeped into him, a pulse that drowned out the ache in his bones, her jade skin rough against his where their hands brushed. The air thickened, their breaths mingling in short, uneven bursts, a quiet sound that filled the cave like a secret no one else could hear. They melted into each other, not with force or frenzy, but like shadows folding into one, each touch a silent answer to a question neither had asked. Her fingers curled against his arm, claws grazing just enough to anchor him, while his hand slid to her back, tracing the strength beneath her torn armor. When a moment crested, it wasn't loud or wild. It was a hush, a shared stillness that carried more weight than words. She pulled back first, resting against him, her dark hair spilling across his shoulder like ink over stone. "What are you to me?" she whispered, her voice raw, almost fragile. Kael chuckled softly, his hand lingering on her spine. "Probably the biggest trouble I've ever signed up for, but I'm not complaining." She tilted her head, her red eyes softening, a rare crack in her iron shell. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cave, something solid had taken root, forged in dust and blood. A bond neither of them could deny, and neither wanted to. The peace summit convened in the fortress's grand chamber, a cavernous space where torchlight flickered like restless ghosts against the stone walls. The air thrummed with tension, thick as the mountain itself, as Beastfolk elders and human delegates filled the tiered benches. Whispers darted through the crowd, some sharp with suspicion, others heavy with exhaustion. Kael stood at the center of the circular floor, his black diplomatic coat creased but steady, the earth insignia glinting faintly on his chest. Beside him, Sylra towered in full ceremonial armor, her jade skin catching the firelight, her red eyes fixed ahead. They didn't need to look at each other. Their presence spoke louder than words. A grizzled Beastfolk elder rose first, his voice rumbling like gravel. "You weaken us, Sylra, tying yourself to this human." The accusation hung heavy, drawing growls from his peers. Sylra stepped forward, her boots striking the stone with a sound that cut through the noise. "I don't weaken," she said, her tone hard as the blade at her hip. "I found one who doesn't flee, who stands when others would break. I chose him." Her words landed like a hammer, silencing the room for a breath. Kael took his cue, his voice calm but edged with steel. Peace isn't ink on a page or promises traded over drinks. It's built by people who risk everything to hold it together. I chose her, same as she chose me. Not for politics, but because it's real. He paused, letting his gaze sweep the chamber. "You can fight that, or you can join it." The room erupted. Beastfolk bared teeth, humans hissed into calms, chaos swirling like dust in a storm. Sylra's hand found his under the table, her claws brushing his skin in a quiet, defiant claim. Before the uproar could peak, she pulled him closer, her lips meeting his in a kiss that wasn't loud or showy, just firm, deliberate, like a line drawn in the sand. The chamber froze, then exploded again, gasps and shouts ricocheting off the walls. Kael pulled back, a grin tugging at his mouth. "Guess we're all in now, huh?" Sylra's eyes glinted, a rare spark of mischief in their red depths. "You started it," she muttered, low enough for only him to hear. A younger Beastfolk counselor stood then, her voice cutting through the din. "I've lost kin to this war. I never thought a human could be more than an enemy, but I've seen them. I believe them." Her words rippled outward, not quelling the storm, but shifting it. The elders muttered, some with reluctant nods, others with clenched jaws. A human delegate shot up, face pinched. "You've no authority to speak for Earth, Kael. This compromises everything." Kael met his glare, unflinching. "Neutrality's a coward's game. Commitment builds peace. I made mine. You figure out yours." The man sat, his silence sharp as a blade. The summit ended without fanfare. No signatures, no grand truce, just a fragile crack in the wall of war. As they left the chamber, Kael and Sylra walked side by side, their guards trailing at a distance. The corridor stretched ahead, its stone walls scarred from battles long past. Kael glanced at her, his voice light, but laced with truth. "So, we're officially a 2-for-1 target now, right?" Sylra's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "Good. I'll hunt better with you." He laughed, the sound bouncing off the stone. "If you're hunting me next, I'm billing Earth for double pay. Hazard rates apply." She tilted her head, her red eyes softening as they reached a wide window overlooking the fog-draped forest below. Her hand slipped into his, claws resting gently against his palm, and they stood there, the world beyond the glass a blur of shadow and promise. The wind howled outside, carrying whispers of unrest. Rogue factions plotting, councils scheming. But inside, something stood firm. Peace remained a distant flicker, fragile as a candle in a gale. Yet between them burned a steadier light. Kael squeezed her hand, his grin fading to something quieter. "Think we'll make it?" Sylra's gaze lingered on the horizon, then shifted to him, steady and sure. "We already have." They stayed there as the torches dimmed, two figures carved against the stone, not invincible but unshaken. The future loomed, messy, uncertain, bristling with enemies, but it didn't matter. They'd built something amid the wreckage, not perfect or polished, just real. And whatever came next, they'd face it together, with a laugh, a glance, and a bond no war could break.